True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Brandon Michael Reid was in and out of hospitals from infancy. His mother, Tanya, a devoted mother and part-time nurse, really seemed to take her son's illnesses in stride. But when a pattern emerged suggesting Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy, Brandon Michael was put into foster care. Then, an investigation into Tanya's past would reveal a very disturbing history. Join us at the quiet end today for A Mother's Love, as we examine a case of serial child abuse perpetrated in multiple states by a pretty unlikely suspect.
So today we're going to have a nice IPA from Carback Brewing Company in Houston. It's called Hopadillo IPA. And this is a pretty nice example of, I guess you'd call it old school IPA, West Coast IPA. It's a nice amber color, great big huge white fluffy head. Aroma's mostly pine, a little bit of citrus. Ditto for the taste, it's mostly pine, just a hint of some grapefruit. It's a full-bodied, fairly sweet beer. Very nice IPA.
Now, I personally am not a fan of the pine, but that's a West Coast attribute?
That's a West Coast attribute.
So what kind of IPA is more fruity?
Well, those are the newer ones called New England IPAs.
Right.
Tend to be very fruity.
Those are the ones I like.
I know.
Not that anyone cares, but just to let you know.
Well, again, this is a pretty nice beer.
Yeah, I think maybe that pine is just kind of an acquired taste. You have to get used to it. It's a little weird at first.
Well, sometimes they can really overdo it and make it more difficult to enjoy. But this is a nice beer.
Yeah. Well, in that way, I think the pine is kind of similar to the smoke. I don't like the smoky either, usually.
I hear you.
Yeah. But I do think that's kind of an acquired taste. So let's open it up and give it a whirl. I'm still going to give it a try.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, let's take this Hopadillo down to the quiet end.
We'll hop on down to the quiet end.
I will give high marks to the can. Really cute.
Yeah, you like the can art?
I do. Very nice. And I think that other people will enjoy it, so I'm glad I brought a six-pack today.
Yeah, there's plenty of people down here today.
Yeah.
So
beautiful weather down here. It's already warming up like it's springtime.
Getting there.
Yeah, I enjoy that. So why don't you, as you normally do, start us out today? We've got a lot to talk about here, a lot of medical stuff, so I enjoy that.
Well, I do too, although I'll try my best.
Hey, we have faith in you.
So Tanya Thaxton Reid grew up in a family of girls. Her parents, Wanda and John Thaxton, settled in the Texas Panhandle in the early 1950s. John worked at the local electric company, and Wanda stayed home with her daughters. And there were a few of them. The oldest Thaxton daughter was Beverly Kay. She was followed 2 years later by Rodina. Then a year after that was Leslie. And then Mom must have gotten tired because Tanya, the baby, was born 4 years after Leslie.
Took a little break there. And then that was the end of it. Yeah, but this is the 50s. 4 kids was not unusual at all.
No, that wasn't.
No.
And what do we have, like 6 years or so apart?
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah.
But I have 4 girls in 6 years, or 4 children in 6 years.
It's a handful, no doubt. Is. Absolutely.
Now, the 3 older girls were all lighter skinned with blue and green eyes. Tanya stood out. She had dark eyes, dark hair, and a dark complexion.
Well, kind of like the milkman, as my mother used to say.
Uh-huh. And there was a maternal uncle who was a fan of the Lone Ranger TV show, and he began calling Tanya Tonto, the name of the Lone Ranger's Native American sidekick. So this nickname apparently caught on, and Tanya was known to her family as Tonto throughout her life.
Yeah, a little. I don't think that would fly today as far as political correctness, but back then that was totally something people did.
That's right.
Yeah. Of course, I don't think Lone Ranger would fly very well today either, so.
No.
Well, Beverly Kay was 8 years old when her parents brought Tanya home from the hospital. And Beverly Kay, of course, loved her new baby sister. And for a lot of the time, she'd become a primary caretaker for Tanya. Beverly Kay even called Tanya her real live baby doll. And just 2 months after Tanya's birth, Wanda, the mother, was hospitalized for appendicitis, which, was a bigger deal back then. There was some hospitalization for several days, and she had to rest, and John, of course, had to work. So Beverly Kay took over pretty much all of the responsibilities of caring for her baby sister Tanya. And over the years of Tanya's childhood, Wanda had multiple health problems. And I only bring these up because I think it could have affected the way that Tanya turned out, unfortunately, in a bad way. Wanda was bedridden for arthritis, mononucleosis, hepatitis, and even spinal meningitis. So bedridden for the better part of 2 years, Wanda left Beverly Kay in charge again of a lot of things for a kid,
Yeah, and she's like, what, 10 by this time?
Yeah, not very old.
No.
But Tanya would recall one of her earliest memories of her mother was when her mother was hospitalized, and this was a fond memory. She also had some really good memories of her own hospitalization as a child. Tanya had a small cyst removed from under her left arm, and because her mother Wanda was in the hospital at the same time, Tanya was allowed to stay in the bed with her mother and have her individual attention for several hours. Now this is from a child who really hadn't seen much of her mother. She'd pretty much been raised by her big sister. So I could really think it's safe to say that this cemented some positive ideas about being in the hospital for Tanya.
Oh, I think so. Now, growing up, Tanya didn't have too many friends. Fortunately, she had her sisters around. All 4 of the girls were active in their church choir, and they traveled to different states to perform. And this was a real treat, because the town where they lived in Texas was isolated, and there just wasn't anything to do there.
Well, not only was there not much to do, but Dad was super strict with those girls. One weird rule he has was that they couldn't date the same boy twice, because that would lead to them getting serious and possibly becoming physically involved with the boy.
Well, we can't have that.
Right. So he had some weird rules like that. He was very strict. And when they were pretty young still, John Thaxton left the electric company where he worked, and he tried his hand at selling insurance. He was pretty successful, and his success in sales built up his confidence, and he ended up opening a medical supply store with a friend of his who had owned a local pharmacy. And John went on the road to make sales, going to nursing homes, doctors' offices, and even hospitals. Eventually, Wanda joined him, and she took over the home health care division of the company. So healthcare had become the family business by this point, and this is the environment that Tanya grew up in.
And as Tanya got older, there was some suggestion that she may have Munchausen Syndrome. And the first known incident suggesting this occurred during Tanya's freshman year in high school. As Wanda prepared the family dinner, Tanya was standing in front of the TV, and out of nowhere, Wanda heard a loud crash. She found Tanya apparently unconscious on the living room floor. Wanda called 911. Tanya was taken to the hospital. The following morning, Tanya said she felt fine and had no memory of the incident. No medical cause for the incident could be determined.
Yeah, and Tanya had another one of these spells about a week later. She wasn't hospitalized this time, but a lot of testing was ordered by her doctor. But he landed on this vague diagnosis of chemical imbalance in Tanya's brain, suggesting the onset was related to puberty. Think there's any legitimacy to that?
No.
I mean, I've heard of growing pains.
That's what you would say when you don't have a clue.
Yeah.
You must have a chemical imbalance.
Yeah, I don't think that you really get away with that anymore. Is that something you'd ever say to a patient?
Oh, no.
No. It's almost like the vapors. It's like a more modern version of that.
Yeah. I mean, if you're better off saying, I'm going to refer you to a specialist.
Sure.
Or get a second opinion or something. I mean, saying that you have a chemical imbalance just opens up so many other questions.
Yeah, with no answers ever.
Absolutely not.
Right. Well, these incidents really weren't looked at as serious by the Thaxton family anyway. They were busy. But later, when Tanya's children had health issues, Beverly Kay really wondered if Tanya and her children shared an undiagnosed genetic disorder. Tanya met her husband-to-be in the 1970s. And the way this happened was that her dad, John Thaxton, was planning to cut down a big dying weeping willow tree in their yard. And Tanya was the only girl that was home, as the youngest, so she was chosen to help him. John went to his neighbor Jim Reid's house to borrow some gasoline for his chainsaw, and Jim happened to be home and offered to help them. So he was a good 10 years older than Tanya, I think. She was still in high school. And she didn't think much of him at first, and he was this older guy. He smoked, he was serious, no fun. He's no James Dean, that's for sure. But Jim was very attracted to Tanya from the beginning. He asked her out several times before she finally agreed, and I guess her dad had no problem with that. But there weren't a lot of choices of guys her age in her hometown. And Jim, he had some good points, so Tanya's parents approved of him. Hard-working guy, if nothing else.
Yeah, he'd come up from extreme poverty. He worked hard as a meat packer, and this was while he was still in high school. Now, he was determined to make a better life for himself, and he earned a business degree from a small public college.
And this is pretty impressive from where he came from, Dick. We're talking real poverty here, where he was a very young man, really a kid, when he had to work in a slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
So how can you not be serious when your life is that shitty from the beginning?
You're right.
And he did take charge of it, so I do admire that.
He did.
Yeah.
He worked through.
He sure did, and it couldn't have been easy.
No. Now, Jim worked for Swift Meats Company, and he was promoted to the Cactus, Texas plant. And that's where the Thaxton family lived. He bought a house next door to them.
Right, but dating Jim really changed the high school Tanya's lifestyle. I mean, he's older, he has a good job, he's pretty serious. He has no desire to hang out with Tanya's high school friends, at the soda bar or whatever kids did back then. The movies, things like that. That was just silly to him. But he did seem to like Tanya, and things became serious quickly. And Tanya started talking about marriage. Because that was her goal. That's what her sisters talked about. That's what she was raised to want in her life, is to get married and have a family. But some of Tanya's friends felt like Jim was kind of distant and didn't show much affection for Tanya. But Tanya claimed that he was the love of her life, even though her friends didn't see it, and they really worried that Tanya was going with Jim just to please her parents and kind of settle.
In 1976, Tanya graduated high school, and she made plans to start the licensed vocational nursing program at the Duma Hospital Nursing School. And then she became engaged to Jim. They'd been dating for over 6 months. They were planning to marry that November. Now, Tanya's parents, Wanda and John, were just thrilled by this. Jim offered some stability to their youngest daughter, and that's a good thing, according to the parents.
Well, of course. I mean, that's a good thing to all parents.
So in the months leading up to her wedding, Tanya was hired as a LVN. She planned to take courses towards a nursing degree with the goal of one day becoming a registered nurse. At the same time, she's starting to have cold feet about marrying Jim, and she shared her doubts with her sisters and mother. Wanda told Tanya that she's just having the new bride jitters, but Tanya decided she's going to call it off. Then in the end, though, she ended up feeling like she had to go through with marrying him. That's a good start, isn't it?
Yeah, so she married Jim Reid in 1977, and they honeymooned on Padre Island off of the Texas Gulf Coast. And then Tanya was immediately making plans to become a mother. Wanda and John Thaxton saw their youngest daughter being married off as a real relief to them. They'd always worried about keeping their girls out of trouble. And they always saw the boys in town as their enemies. So to have all of their daughters married off gave them peace of mind. They thought, all right, we're done with that. We've done it. They're all safe and married. We can move on. So Tanya moved in with Jim, but they did live next door to her parents for a bit. And they saw each other quite often. But Jim kind of kept his distance from the family more than the other son-in-laws did. For one thing, he worked really long hours, and he was very focused on making money. And we know from his childhood that's why.
Right, we do.
Tanya visited her mother during the day, and they also went out shopping and doing other errands together. And on the weekends, the couples did occasionally share a breakfast or a dinner at Tanya's parents' house. But over time, Tanya did share with her family that Jim was very tight with their money. And this really shouldn't have been a surprise to her, although she was young, so she probably didn't give it much thought in the beginning. The thing was that he could spend money on whatever he wanted, but Tanya was in a position where she had to ask his permission. She was even on a weekly allowance, and if she wanted more money, she had to go work for it. So Tanya began to realize that she had left this domineering father to just live with another domineering man that was her husband. So she'd really just jumped from one disaster to the other. Well, maybe not a disaster, but a less than ideal situation in both counts.
That's better.
Yeah.
So Tanya is working at the hospital and taking her RN courses. And she's also starting to talk about a family. She wants to get pregnant. But her house needed renovations. Tanya ended up quitting her job at the hospital, taking a better paying job as Swift Meats. Now her family was surprised that she would give up on nursing. But Tanya wanted more than anything to have a baby, and she needed to fix up the house before that could happen.
Yeah, so she was pretty much willing to do whatever it took.
Yeah. So she got pregnant in 1980. And shortly after, she and Jim moved to a new house in a neighborhood with other families. Now, they were still only a mile or so from the Thaxton house, so it was close enough to drop by any time. But at the same time, they weren't next door. They had a little bit more privacy this way.
Yeah, so that seemed like a pretty ideal situation. And Tanya gave birth to her first child, Karen, in October of 1980. Karen was delivered by the same family doctor who had delivered Tanya 20 years earlier. So Tanya felt pretty happy at this point in her life. She had a new home, a new baby. Her parents were close enough when she needed them, but not right there. And she was able to go back to nursing school. So things were pretty good. And Jim even seemed pretty excited about being a new dad. But then over time, Tanya seemed kind of unhappy. She became jealous of the attention that her parents were giving to her sisters, and she was jealous of Jim's work friends, too. She really didn't like to share Jim's attention with anyone, and that's when she began to threaten divorce. And Jim felt like Tanya was being totally unreasonable. If it weren't for Karen, he would have left Tanya, he would say later, but he was trying to stick it out for his daughter's sake. Then in 1981, Jim was transferred to the Swift Chicago plant, and he and Tanya decided it would be good for both of their careers to go out there. Jim moved east within weeks, while Tanya stayed behind to sell their house and to organize the move. And she seemed to like this neighborhood in suburban Chicago quite a bit.
Yeah, it was a small community. Now, Jim could commute to work. It took about half an hour by train. And a few months after they arrived, Tanya took a part-time nursing job at Edward Hospital. And the couple met two other couples, the Carricks and the Jacomeks. And the three couples played cards together, eating pizza, drinking beer. Sounds like a nice thing.
Yeah, but then Tanya began to complain of stomach pains. And she said she had suffered the same issues when she was in high school. So after doing numerous tests, her doctor diagnosed her with ulcers and prescribed a bland diet. But when that failed to help, Tanya was hospitalized, and they couldn't find anything wrong with her. But later, Tanya would say that the pains were probably stress-related. There was a lot going on. You know, she'd moved with the baby and everything. This is a girl who'd grown up in this tiny little town. So moving to a Chicago suburb was a pretty big deal.
Boy, I guess. In May of 1983, Tanya was pregnant with her second child and due to give birth soon. Wanda was staying with her to help out with Karen. And one day, Tanya came home after a doctor's appointment, told Wanda that the doctor had been unable to find the baby's heartbeat. So she said that she needed to rush to the hospital and be induced for labor. Now, that just doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, if you're the doc and you're examining this person and you don't detect a fetal heartbeat, you're not going to send her home and say, get to the hospital.
Well, let's be honest, the baby would probably already be deceased.
Right.
It takes a matter of minutes.
Doesn't take long.
No. So if someone comes into an appointment, there's no fetal heart rate. There's no baby, no viable baby.
It's an emergency.
Exactly. So she went home to drive herself to the hospital.
Yeah. So the likelihood is that this is how Tanya viewed things.
Well, did she view things that way, or did she play things up for attention? That's where I'm looking at it from.
Well, either way. Same thing.
Well, no, because truly believing it would be very different from the fact that she was conniving and manipulating to get attention, which is the way I see it anyway. So Tanya did drive herself to the hospital, even stopped to drop off her older daughter with a babysitter. Red flag. But then her baby, Morgan Renee Reid, was delivered vaginally and was perfectly healthy. Tanya would tell stories about it almost being a C-section. There really was no proof that there was any emergency.
Well, there couldn't have been. If there was, she would have had a cesarean section.
Well, she was past due and she probably went in to be induced, but there was no emergency to it.
No.
And it's kind of funny, Tanya named her daughter Morgan after the actress Morgan Fairchild.
Okay.
Which is fine. And Morgan's infancy was pretty normal and uneventful. That is until June 10th of 1983.
Yeah, Tanya took Morgan to the pediatrician, and the baby had a severe raised rash on her back. And also, Tanya had complaints that Morgan was a colicky baby. Now, after a thorough exam, the doctor declared Morgan to be perfectly healthy. She looked good. She was gaining weight. He said the rash was nothing to worry about, and he sent them home.
Right, but Tanya really wasn't happy with this doctor, Dr. Kudchadkur's diagnosis. She said that something was seriously wrong with her daughter and further testing should have been done. So she wasn't going to stay with him. Soon after, Tanya called her friend, Lynn Jakimick, and asked for a referral to another pediatrician. She felt that her pediatrician was missing something serious, she said, and she wanted a second opinion. And Lynn recommended Dr. Jerry Skirka. Just a few minutes after hanging up the phone, Lynn saw Tanya's car pull out of her driveway. So she learned the next day that Tanya had met Dr. Skirka at the hospital right away to have him examine Morgan. And Dr. Skirka apparently recommended a new formula and the rash cleared up overnight. That's according to Tanya. But rashes are very common with babies.
They're very common. They can come and go. I'm not sure they can come and go overnight, but they can come and go fairly quickly. Whether it's a food allergy or another reaction or a virus, I mean, there's a host of things that will give you baby rashes.
So 2 months later, Saturday, August 6th, Tanya and Jim had an argument. He was going on a business trip and she wanted to go with him, and this was overheard by their friends. But Jim insisted that she couldn't go, she needed to stay home with the children, and Tanya had seemed very upset about it. And shortly afterwards, she became really sick to her stomach. So that Monday, August 8th, Lynn learned that Morgan had been taken by ambulance to the hospital because the baby had stopped breathing, and Tanya had revived her with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. At this point, Morgan is only 2 months old. So according to Tanya, after feeding and burping her baby, she'd just run out to get the mail, and when she returned, she found Morgan blue and unmoving. She said she slapped the baby's face to get a response, and then she began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Morgan started breathing on her own, and Tanya called 911. Any comments on that so far?
No, I mean, she's a 2-month-old baby. This would be something that you'd probably call at the time a near-miss SIDS, or now is called an apparent life-threatening event. So some unexplained reason the baby's not breathing, and they're going to be hospitalizing her and doing a bunch of studies.
Well, when they arrived at the emergency room, the doctors and nurses were pretty surprised, though, by how healthy the baby looked. Tests, including blood work, a CAT scan, and an EEG were all normal, but her chest x-ray did show a slight pneumonia in one of her lungs. Which isn't very uncommon, really.
No, I guess it depends on who's reading the x-ray, but infants often have what looks like infiltrates and slight, in quotation marks, pneumonia. And it may or may not mean anything in terms of being actually an illness or an infection. Tanya insisted that Morgan be transferred to Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago, which she was, and she was there for 4 days. The discharge diagnosis was near-miss sudden infant death syndrome. Now, this in reality meant that the doctors didn't have any reason for Morgan to have stopped breathing.
Yeah, but there was some good news in this for Tanya. Jim was able to come home early from his business trip to be with her.
Then over the next several months, Morgan had a few other episodes that were similar to this first one. She had a second episode in August, 4 in September, and 1 in October. Each time, Tanya was alone with her daughter, and she saved her with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation.
So Tanya was really the center of attention after that at a gathering of Jim's co-workers and their families. She carried Morgan with her, as well as Morgan's apnea monitor. So all of the women were expressing pity for Tanya, who said she couldn't leave Morgan out of her sight even for a second. But Tanya seemed kind of matter-of-fact about it, not really terrified as most mothers would be. She told her stories of a blue baby in this relaxed, kind of calm tone, but the other mothers were impressed by it. She was a nurse. She seemed to have it all together. One woman even said, God must choose each baby's parents. A mother who is a nurse is the perfect fit for a baby who stops breathing.
Fortunately for that baby, huh?
Yeah, that lucky baby.
Yeah. So Dr. Skirka, who's now Morgan's pediatrician, eventually became concerned about the possibility of Munchausen by proxy. Now that's been renamed, so we're now going to call it factitious disorder imposed on another.
Oh, gee, I don't know if I can do that.
But we'll stick with Munchausen.
I think so.
But if you look at the ICD-9 or whatever it is, Munchausen is now factitious disorder imposed on another.
Well, sure. I mean, it's more accurate, but we all know what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And you're going to give us a little more background on that. But, Skirka's worried because these episodes are happening and there's no medical reason, and Tanya's a little bit off. So he questioned Lynn Jakimick about whether anyone else had ever been present when Morgan stopped breathing, and Lynn did some of her own investigating. Remember, she's Tanya's neighbor, and she works with Dr. Skirka. So it seemed that no one else had witnessed any of Morgan's events. So after that, Lynn and some of the other neighborhood women began to keep an eye on Tanya and Morgan and kind of keep track of things. They were getting worried. Most of our people listening probably know what this syndrome is about, but maybe you can give us just a quick Reader's Digest version of what we're talking about here.
It'll be quick. So Munchausen Syndrome was first described, 50, 60 years ago. And this is where an adult feigns illness for a variety of reasons, mostly to gain attention. It's different from a hypochondriac because these people aren't pretending. They think they are sick, hypochondriacs. Munchausens know they're not sick, but they're doing things to make the medical profession think they're ill.
Well, see, that's what I was getting at earlier, is this is done on purpose, really. It's not looked at as a psychological problem. It's someone manipulating the system for their own gain.
Well, it is a psychological problem that they're doing it.
Well, they have a psychological problem.
Right.
But the syndrome is not a psychological problem. It's something that's done to a victim when you get to the proxy.
We haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
So that's Munchausen.
Okay.
Then Munchausen by proxy is where an adult, a caretaker usually, feigns illness in a child. So this is a textbook example, finding a child not breathing. And there's other things like people can look at seizure activity, failure to thrive, a whole variety of things that can be illnesses inflicted on a child. So that's Munchausen by proxy.
Right. So it was actually a pregnant pediatric pulmonary fellow at Baylor University, Carol Rosen, who first decided that Tanya was a Munchausen mom. When she heard about Tanya, she'd already investigated a case of 2 Houston children who'd had unexplained episodes of apnea. And these episodes had happened at least once a day. It was eventually determined that their mother was suffocating them. So after that, Dr. Rosen had read all of the literature she could find on Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and she would eventually publish a paper about that Houston case. So Dr. Rosen interviewed Tanya Reid about Morgan's medical history and determined that something was wrong there. And when she examined Morgan, she found her to be a happy but developmentally delayed baby. At 9 months old, she couldn't sit upright without support. So when do babies usually sit upright without support? I can't remember.
Well, they should be able to sit up by 6 months.
So a neurologist ordered a polygraphic sleep study where brain waves and oxygen levels were monitored as a video camera kept a visual record. It had been speculated that Morgan could have a problem with the area of her brain that controls breathing. But it was really odd that Morgan's episodes only happened when she was awake.
Now, her testing was totally normal, and there were no apneic episodes recorded.
So why is it unusual that it only happened when she was awake?
Well, there's no reason for it to be limited to waking periods. Anything that causes you to have apnea is going to occur anytime, not just during waking hours.
So Morgan was held in a step-down area of the ICU, and this was an open area with several kids there. Morgan had been there for 6 days and had no apneic episodes. So Tanya was sleeping at the nearby Ronald McDonald house and spending her days caring for Morgan. It was at 2 p.m. on January 22, 1984, when Tanya took Morgan to a playroom on another end of the hospital. Then at 3:12 p.m., Tanya was running down the hall of the step-down unit with a white, blue-lipped, limp Morgan in her arms. And she was screaming that Morgan had stopped breathing. So this is after 6 days, no incidents. She takes her baby off the unit and boom, in an hour, the baby has stopped breathing.
Yeah, and this is a woman who's already under suspicion. Yeah.
Early phases of suspecting her, but yes.
So, and this will help keep those suspicions up.
Oh, absolutely.
So she wasn't breathing, but did have a heartbeat. So nurses bagged her. That means they put a bag and mask over her face and gave her some ventilation. They gave her 100% oxygen, and she almost immediately began crying. Her color quickly returned, and the baby fell asleep. Tanya would be described to Dr. Rosen as being concerned about Morgan, but matter of fact.
Yeah, so later that day, Tanya told nurses that she had personal matters to attend to back home and would need to go. But by then, Dr. Rosen was convinced that Morgan was a victim of Munchausen Syndrome by proxy. She didn't have a seizure or any breathing disorder that was diagnosed. So after days of hospital observation, Morgan only had spells when she had been alone with her mother. Dr. Rosen took her conclusions to the admitting neurologist. But according to the neurologist, they didn't have enough proof to report this case as a child abuse case, or even to confront Tanya Reid. So the neurologist suggested secret video surveillance in the sleep lab so that Tanya could be caught in the act of smothering her baby. So Dr. Rosen spoke to Tanya, really encouraging her to stay for more testing. But Tanya was adamant. She probably knew that something was going on there. And she refused to stay. She insisted that she had to return home.
Yeah, by this time they had moved back to Texas, so this whole evaluation was in Texas.
Right.
Not in Chicago.
Right. Chicago had sent her back, and then she'd gone back to a Texas hospital. That's right.
So although Tanya knew the hospital staff was suspicious of her, she didn't mention anything to her family.
If it's normal and you're innocent, I think you would.
She's going to keep it a secret.
Keeping it secret, to me, looks like some guilt.
So Dr. Rosen's nurse tried to reach the Reids by phone on January 3rd and 31st, but she was unsuccessful. She finally reached Tanya and spoke with her on February 2nd. Now, Tanya told her that Morgan was fine. She was on phenobarbital, and no apneic episodes had occurred since her hospital discharge. So somebody must have thought she was having seizures to put her on phenobarbital.
Well, Tanya did. I don't know if she'd convinced the doctor to do that, but there was one doctor who did believe that Morgan may have had a seizure disorder and had gone along with what Tanya was saying, at least for a while. But Dr. Rosen's nurse made follow-up calls on February 9th and February 10th to check in again, because they're worried about Morgan. They know that her life is in danger. Then on February 11th, the nurse reached Tanya and was told that Morgan had suffered this terrible apneic spell and had died 3 days earlier at Northwest Texas Children's Hospital. So this was shocking. And when Dr. Rosen heard the news, she was just mortified. She had known that Morgan's life was in danger, and she felt like she'd failed to save this baby.
So Dr. Rosen spoke with Dr. Ian Burkett, who was the pathologist who did an autopsy on baby Morgan. She told Dr. Burkett that she believed Morgan was a victim of Munchausen's by proxy. Now, Dr. Burkett suggested that a subdural hematoma that he had found on Morgan's autopsy could have happened during a forceful resuscitation. Now, Dr. Rosen didn't believe that was possible and told him that Morgan probably had died from child abuse. She then contacted Dr. Rolf Habersang, and this is the pediatrician who had admitted Morgan to the hospital in Texas. He understood shaken baby syndrome and subdural hematomas, and he agreed with her concerns. So Dr. Habersang called Dr. Burkett and asked him to take a closer look, but Burkett concluded there was no evidence of child abuse. Now, since he was the pathologist, he had the final say, but Dr. Rosen wasn't going to give up easily. She requested Morgan's records from Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago, as well as Morgan's birth records. Then in January of 1986, Dr. Rosen presented her article on Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy at a conference in Palm Springs, California. Dr. Rosen had personally seen 6 Munchausen patients, 3 of whom had died, and Morgan was one of those 3. One of the doctors that Dr. Rosen saw at that conference was a doctor who had written a discharge summary for one of Morgan's hospitalizations. He knew the Reids, and he told Dr. Rosen that the Reid's son was having similar events.
Wow. So that must have been pretty disturbing to her.
Don't you think?
I think so.
Wow.
And can you tell us a little bit about the subdural hematoma situation? I know we've talked about shaken baby before, but I know there's been updates to that too over the years.
Yeah, there are. The subdural hematoma, well, let's back up. Shaken baby syndrome was described years and years ago. And the idea is that if you have an infant and you hold them and shake them forcibly, you can have some bleeding. And this is manifested by subdural hematomas and by retinal hemorrhages. Over the years, there's been a lot of controversy on shaken baby syndrome. Now it's called abusive head trauma, not shaken baby syndrome, because the trauma can occur without shaking the baby.
Well, yeah, it's anything with a whiplash, like it can be from slamming a baby down hard too, right?
Right.
And the reason you know that is different from other head traumas. There's no exterior damage noted.
Correct.
Okay. So some people have tried to argue that it's not a real thing.
Yes, but it is.
Okay. All right. Well, there are people who don't believe it. That's the only reason I'm bringing it up. I know you believe it.
Well, I think if you asked pediatricians, you'd probably get close to 100%.
Most of the literature is definitely on board with that.
So when Morgan had her final apneic event, Wanda and John Thaxton, Tanya's parents, were away on a medical supplies sales trip near Lubbock, Texas. They got a message that Morgan had suffered another apneic spell. But when Wanda finally spoke with her daughter, she learned that this wasn't like the other spells. Morgan was on life support. She had a flat EEG, which would indicate no brain activity, no brain function. The doctor at the hospital had recommended taking her off of life support because her brainwaves showed severe brain damage, and it was unlikely that she'd ever recover from that.
So I have a lot of nightmares, but this is one of the big ones because I just can't imagine, because that baby looks fine, really, right? And to make that decision to take the life support away, even having the knowledge that you do, it has to be hard to make that decision because the baby's still there. The baby's still pink.
Yeah, but there's no brain function.
But emotionally.
Oh, sure.
It's got to just tear you apart to make that decision. The family members came in, and after they took her off life support, it took several hours before she stopped breathing, so just horrific. So it was February 8th when Morgan died in 1984, and the cause of death was sudden infant death syndrome on the report. And Tanya said she was mad at God and she stopped going to church. She had been a big churchgoer before that, so it had made a big change in her life.
In May of 1985, Brandon Michael Reid was born, and in May of 1987, the Reid family moved from Texas to Des Moines, Iowa.
Since Morgan's death, they moved to Chicago. Then they returned to Amarillo. Then they were moving to Iowa because Jim kept being transferred by Swift. And he wasn't very happy about this because his pay had been cut and he'd been moved to an evening shift at this point. But, he needed the job, he needed the benefits for his family, so he really felt he had no choice but to go there. And his plan was, once they settled in Iowa, he would look for another job. So by now the oldest child was 6 years old.
That's Karen.
Yeah, and Michael was 2. And he was suffering repeated apneic episodes since his early infancy. Michael was known to have stopped breathing abruptly several times, and he was diagnosed with seizures from an unknown cause.
So a couple weeks after they had settled in Iowa, Tanya and Jim met with a pediatric neurologist to discuss Michael's issues. Tanya told him the sad story of Morgan's SIDS death. Now, she claimed that postmortem testing had revealed that Morgan had Fragile X syndrome, and Tanya believed that she was a carrier, but testing on her was negative. Now, the neurologist knew of no link between Fragile X and SIDS.
So what do we need to know about Fragile X in this case? Anything?
Well, Fragile X is a syndrome where there's a gene on an X chromosome that doesn't function properly, so you don't make enough of an enzyme that helps in protein synthesis. And if you have that, you tend to be developmentally delayed, a lot of speech and language difficulties. There's a high incidence of autism spectrum, attention deficit disorder, anxiety, stuff like that in people affected with Fragile X.
So babies don't stop breathing because of it is the point here, really?
No, they do not.
Okay.
And the other thing is that it's a X-linked dominant disorder. That means that both males and females are affected. Females usually way less than males. If Tanya believes she was a carrier, and I'm going to assume they did chromosome testing on her that was negative, she's not a carrier.
Right. She wasn't a carrier. So, I think she just made this whole thing up is what I'm getting at here, really.
Oh, sure.
To keep it simple.
Yes, although she should have done a little more research because there isn't any link between Fragile X and apnea or SIDS.
Well, she's one of these people that has just enough medical knowledge to be dangerous, really.
So the Reids were living in an apartment in Urbandale, Iowa, which is a suburb of Des Moines. They lived in an apartment that was in a large development of apartments and townhomes. And most of the families had very young children. Now, leaving Texas had been difficult for Tanya because she was leaving her parents and sisters behind. And notably, when you looked at things in retrospect, whenever Tanya was nearer her family, Michael would have fewer apneic episodes.
Right. So the Reids had moved into their new apartment July 1st, 1987, and it was 2 days later when Tanya brought Michael into the ER with a fever, and she told the staff about this big history of his. He wasn't eating, and he'd been vomiting, she said, and she insisted on multiple tests being done. He was given IV fluids, and on the third day of hospitalization, he was discharged. And Tanya was having trouble making friends in her new neighborhood and spending a lot of her time isolated in this small apartment. She tried hanging out by the community pool, but the other moms already had groups of friends and really didn't seem very interested in befriending and getting to know Tanya. She said they were polite, but kind of too busy to get to know her. And Tanya was a talker. She really liked to have social interactions. Now, one neighbor, Stacy Sue Mullins, took pity on Tanya. Stacy was a newly divorced mom, and she had a daughter the same age as Tanya's oldest daughter, Karen. Stacy was a nurse, and Tanya told Stacy all about her own nursing career, as well as her son's health issues. Stacy had lost her son in a plane crash a while back, and Tanya opened up and told her about Morgan's death from SIDS. But to Stacy, things seemed a little off. It almost seemed as if Tanya was competing to have the most tragic story. To Stacy, Tanya seemed a bit too eager and overly familiar. She even offered to babysit Stacy's daughter on the first day they met. And within days, Tanya was calling on Stacy to babysit her children, Karen and Michael.
In August, Tanya went to the elementary school to request in-home special education for Michael. He was 2.5 years old, but was developmentally delayed. He had a vocabulary of just 1 or 2 words. Now, she was referred to a state agency for children up to 3 years of age, and a worker came to the house to evaluate Michael for services. He was denied services. I don't know why. He's obviously delayed.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. I think that they thought he could get services in a program, but they weren't willing to come to the house. So I don't think he was denied services entirely, but she wasn't given services she wanted, like respite and someone coming to the house.
Okay.
Because
so
they said
they had services to offer him.
They did, but he was pretty functional. I mean, other than the vocabulary and the potty training, he was pretty on target. I mean, he wasn't mentally retarded. So she just wasn't getting the degree of services that she wanted. Tanya volunteered to be Karen's brownie troop leader, but the problem was many of the other mothers didn't like her personality, which was kind of extreme enthusiasm. She scheduled a meeting at her apartment for all of these people in the brownie troop, but only 4 mothers showed up. And she kept trying. She tried really hard to befriend the other mothers, but many of them just didn't like her. She was a nonstop talker and kind of pushy, a little overwhelming, that kind of person. And 2 days after Michael was denied the home special ed services, he had another apnea episode. He turned blue and Tanya called 911, and the first paramedic to arrive was this young guy who lived in an apartment in the same development as them, Nottingham Square. And he was called to the Reid home at 6:25 p.m. on October 9th, 1987. And he would go back there several times. And the paramedic, when he got there, he knocked on the door and came into the Reid's apartment, where he found Tanya kneeling on the floor, giving mouth-to-mouth to Michael. Michael's lips were blue, and the paramedic felt for a pulse and wanted to take over mouth-to-mouth, so he did, and within 30 seconds, Michael gasped and began breathing on his own. Tanya told him that the boy had been watching TV when she came into the room and found him unresponsive. And she told the paramedic about Michael's history of apnea and a seizure disorder. She said that sometimes after a seizure, he would stop breathing, so she assumed he must have had a seizure that day.
Michael got admitted to the Iowa Methodist Medical Center in Des Moines. The pediatric neurologist saw him the next morning. Tanya's story to him was totally different from what she had told the paramedic. She told the neurologist that Michael had started crying after she refused to give him a cookie. So the neurologist suspected that his spells might be caused by breath holding, which is a not uncommon thing in that age group.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. I'd never witnessed anything like that in my lifetime. But kids do that.
Kids will do that. They'll hold their breath long enough that they'll pass out. And as they pass out, they can have a brief seizure because they've been holding their breath. But once they pass out, the airway opens up and they breathe and they're fine. So the suggestion to Tanya was that if she waited a few seconds or a moment, her son would start breathing on his own. The neurologist told Tanya that in her rush to save him, she was probably doing more harm than good, because her mouth-to-mouth efforts could actually be depriving him of oxygen. Now, Tanya didn't really like this idea.
Not one bit. She insisted that her son would not breathe unless she or the paramedics intervened. Medical tests were done again, including an EEG, and they all came back normal, and he seemed perfectly healthy. But the nurses and doctors started to have concerns about the relationship between Tanya and her son, because when Michael was with his mother, he often cried very loudly and would turn or run away from her.
Yeah, well, he's 2.5 now. So if she's doing things to him to make him stop breathing, obstructing his airway,
I know, my
he's
gosh.
going to start figuring out what's going on.
Can you imagine? He'd be terrified.
Yeah.
Holy shit. Yeah, that's just scary. I can imagine he was a really scared little kid.
So 4 days later, Michael was sent home on a dosage of atropine. This is a heart medication, so I'm not sure what that was for. I guess to keep his heart rate up.
Yeah, I guess if they keep the heart rate up, they thought he'd be more likely to not stop breathing. I think at this point they're just trying whatever might work.
The nurses were impressed with Tanya's dedication to her son, and they felt like Michael may have been manipulating her. So right now the nurses are feeling kind of sorry for Tanya.
Which she ate that right up.
Yeah. To suggest that a 2.5-year-old was manipulating the mother.
That's kind of hard to see,
I can't see that.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, neighbor Stacy Mullins was babysitting Karen in the evenings when Tanya was at the hospital and Jim was at work. But, Stacy really didn't enjoy having Tanya in her life. But she kept being there because she felt like the Reid children needed attention, and she was one of the only people around to give them some. But, Tanya didn't have boundaries, and she really shared too much information about her personal life for Stacy's taste. Tanya told Stacy that she was unhappy in her marriage because Jim wasn't showing any interest in her and they weren't having any sex. Stacy knew Tanya was right, though, because she never saw the couple doing anything together. Tanya said she was really worried and sad, But the way she said it was just kind of off-putting because it was very matter-of-fact, like with a smile on her face.
Now, Michael had another apneic episode less than 2 weeks after his first one that he was hospitalized for. And the same paramedic, Tony Collins, was the first to show up at the Reid's home after the 5:51 p.m. rescue call. He found Tanya upstairs giving Michael mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on her bed. She looked up and nodded at the paramedic, but continued mouth-to-mouth. Tony knelt and nudged Tanya, trying to take over, but she ignored him. Between puffs, she was saying, "Breathe, baby, breathe." Now, when Tanya moved out of the way of the paramedic, he saw that Michael was already breathing on his own, and is breathing about 30 times a minute.
Which is pretty normal for a young kid like that.
Yep. Tanya said that she had found Michael lifeless in her bedroom just minutes after he had been playing and laughing. He was taken to the hospital in the ambulance. This time he was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit. The diagnosis was breath-holding spells and apnea. So Michael was given another EEG and is put on a 24-hour Holter monitor. This is a thing to monitor the heartbeat. And if you have a rhythm disturbance or any type of cardiac problem, it'll get printed out on the monitor. He had chest x-rays, he had more blood work. Then, as the nurses were drawing blood, Michael was poked several times and he screamed and struggled. Quite naturally, right?
It's not pleasant for a kid that age to have blood drawn and all that.
No. Pediatric cardiologist determined that Michael had no cardiac problem.
But a pediatric resident was pretty curious about what was going on with this boy. He met with Tanya to discuss the apneic episodes, and he asked Tanya if anyone besides herself had witnessed these episodes. Tanya said that her mother and her husband had both seen one, and she added that back in Illinois, Michael's doctor had witnessed one. So on the third day of this admission, Michael was transferred from the pediatric ICU to the third-floor children's unit. And Tanya told a nurse that she wanted her son to be directly discharged to home. She said that her mother's love and nursing training made her Michael's best caretaker. But, the nurses were kind of worried about this. One RN wrote in Michael's chart, "Mom and child interactions somewhat inappropriate, seem antagonistic toward one another." Now, how can there be any antagonism with a 2.5-year-old and a mother? That's very odd.
No, I think it would go one way.
Yeah, sure.
So the hospital staff made a referral to a counselor. Tanya seemed agitated when questioned about Michael, but seemed way more relaxed when asked about herself. And when the counselor told Tanya that her family could benefit from some therapy, she agreed. Later that day at 5:30 in the afternoon, Tanya seemed restless. When asked if she needed anything, Tanya told Michael's nurse that she was bored. She said that she thought the doctor had kept Michael in the hospital for another day because he was mad at her. That's so strange. I just can't wrap myself around that.
Yeah, that shows a real issue with her mind. But when Michael was discharged, Tanya's story of what was happening with her son just wasn't seeming right at all. But she was very vocal about her belief that her son had some kind of genetic disorder. She said it was the same thing that had killed her daughter Morgan. And the neighbor, Stacy Mullins, was beginning to think that something was going on with Tanya and her overwhelming loneliness. It really worried her that Michael wasn't talking much at his age, and it seemed to her that his relationship with his mother was the core of his problem. Michael always seemed angry when he was with his mother, and when Tanya asked him to do something, he would often refuse and run away from her. But when he was with Stacy at her house, he was happy and playful, like a totally different child. Now, normally I would say kids are almost always better for strangers or other people than for their own parents. But this seemed to be more than just that.
Yeah, it does.
And he's so young.
Mm-hmm. So Tanya tried to blame Michael's not talking on a hearing problem, which is a common thing, but audiologists determined that his hearing was fine. Stacy believed that all of Michael's problems were emotional in origin. Now, the ambulance showed up at the Reid home again November 13th. It was Friday at 5:15. Michael had stopped breathing again. Stacy arrived on the scene right away and found Tanya cradling Michael on the living room floor. He looked pale, but he appeared to be breathing okay. Stacy cried as he was carried to the ambulance, but Tanya seemed unfazed. She instructed Stacy to take Karen so she could ride in the ambulance with Michael.
Yeah, no, she didn't even ask the neighbor. She just said, "You take Karen." So I could see how she was a very annoying person to be around. And that night, Stacy never even heard from Tanya or Jim. She kept their daughter Karen overnight, feeding her, getting her off to school, giving her lunch money the next morning. But it really bothered her that no one had called to check on her, and Tanya just kind of expected Stacy to care for her daughter as if it was her child.
Michael had been brought to the trauma room at the children's hospital, and doctors were kind of surprised to see such a healthy-looking child following a life-threatening episode, as usually such kids appear to be quite sick. But Michael was happy and playful. Tanya seemed very comfortable being back in the medical environment. So things just didn't seem right with this whole scenario.
Sure. Well, I guess Tanya's casual attitude was one of the weirdest things they noticed. She was just very nonchalant for someone who had just saved her son's life. And she gave a detailed history to the doctor. But it takes a while for the medical records to arrive, so by the time they get the full records, Michael would have been discharged and back home again. But there was a pediatric resident there named Bob Coleman, who was beginning to consider Munchausen Syndrome by proxy in Michael's case. He knew Michael Reid after seeing him several times since July, and he knew this was a rare form of child abuse. And of course, this was in the 80s, so it was much less well known than it is now. But after Dr. Coleman said he suspected it, staff physicians decided to watch this case more closely. Tanya did fit the description of a Munchausen parent. She was seen as the perfect mother. She worked in healthcare. She had this weird kind of distant relationship with her spouse. And most disturbing, there was a history of a SIDS death in the Reid family. So these are all big red flags, especially Morgan's death.
Now then, Michael had another episode. This occurred at 5:35 p.m., December 15th. Tanya told the emergency workers that he had been playing in his upstairs bedroom when she found him not breathing. She had given him mouth-to-mouth for 3 minutes before he began breathing on his own again. 3 days later, an in-home family counselor was referred to the Reid family. The Reids told the counselor about Morgan's death, and she is very sympathetic. So the respite care was given to reduce stress in the home. Tanya was certainly happy about the respite care and called her mother to tell her how happy she was to be getting a chance for time for herself. Then in January 1988, the family pediatrician, Dr. Ganginis, referred Michael to the Mayo Clinic. They made 2 visits there without a diagnosis being made. A few days after the second visit, Tanya called 911. It was January 19th, 8:35 p.m. Jim was still at work. Tanya revived Michael, and the paramedics took him back to the hospital.
Yeah, so then, at noontime on February 7th, which was a Sunday, Michael had an episode that was very different than his usual episodes. He was covered in sweat and he was screaming. He was still in his pajamas, and it appeared that he had been fighting for his life. And this was the first time when Jim had been home during one of these spells. Jim had been downstairs, and Tanya and Michael were upstairs. Jim heard them laughing and playing upstairs, but then all of a sudden the house went silent. And a moment later, Jim heard Tanya screaming for him. So he ran up the stairs and saw Michael limp and sweaty on the bed, with Tanya leaning over him, giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Tanya told Jim she'd already called the paramedics, which was kind of weird. And Michael did have a heartbeat, but his face was completely blue. Within a minute, before the paramedics had even arrived, Michael was breathing on his own again, but he seemed really angry. He was taken to the ambulance kicking and screaming, and at the hospital, the staff was familiar with Michael and his mother, and they were pretty upset with this whole situation by now. Because, Michael was different this time, really screaming and thrashing around, really inconsolable, almost hysterical, he was described. So this was very strange. And even stranger, perhaps, Tanya was cool as a cucumber. She talked to the doctors and explained what had happened, and even as her son was going ballistic in the bed, she was going on and on with this detailed story. She really seemed oblivious to Michael, and she didn't even try to comfort him or be near him. And Jim Reid was there this time, but he was always just kind of quiet and stayed off to the side. He didn't say a word.
And the pediatrician on call that night in the hospital was a Dr. Zusha. Now, she was a normally calming and reassuring woman, but this whole scenario outraged her. She came out of the trauma room where Michael was screaming and slammed his chart on the counter. Then she shocked the nurses when she said she's smothering that kid. Now, pediatric resident Bob Coleman, he was there, and he nodded his head in agreement. This has been going on for far too long, he said. So we're finally going to get DHS involved, right?
Right. The Iowa Department of Human Services was called, and a child protective officer was assigned to this case. Both of these doctors believed that Michael was a victim of Munchausen Syndrome by proxy at the hands of his mother. They suspected that she'd been smothering her son because she wanted or needed the attention from the medical personnel. And it wasn't just the screaming that made this incident different. Michael was noted to have 4 parallel scratches on his cheek, which appeared to be made by his fingernails. And 2 of them were deep enough to be bleeding. It was because they were so small that his nurse thought they'd probably been made by him. And he also had a bruise under his left eye. But still, Tanya, the mom, seemed oblivious, and she actually approached Michael's nurse to show her a cut on her finger and asked for a Band-Aid. But during this time, the nurse is putting 2 and 2 together. Like that boy was trying to push her hands or something off his face, cut himself and her. That seemed to make sense. Of course, they have no proof of that.
Nope.
But it sure seemed like that. He was so agitated.
So Michael was admitted to the hospital, and that afternoon the child protective investigator showed up. The investigator first met with the doctors to get Michael's medical history. Dr. Zusha told the investigator about his multiple admissions and about the scratches believed to be from Michael trying to protect himself from his mother as she suffocated him. She said she had no doubt that Tanya was suffocating her son for attention. So foster care was decided upon to protect Michael.
So Dr. Coleman was able to tell the investigator about the Reid's background, too, including Michael's multiple hospital admissions. The Mayo had even declined to do further testing on Michael because they decided there was nothing medically wrong with him. The investigator arrived at Michael's hospital room about 4 p.m. that day, and Michael had calmed down and Jim was alone with him. When the investigator explained the purpose of his visit, Jim seemed really stunned. He called Tanya, who'd gone home to change her clothes, and when she heard, she said she'd be right over. Now, she was really angry and scared. So she left Karen again with Stacy Mullins, and she arrived at the hospital and told Jim she would explain everything to them. There was no problem. So she and Jim were interviewed for 45 minutes. Then Tanya called her sister Rodina about these allegations and got some help hiring an attorney. But Jim was supportive of his wife and said that he knew she'd be proven innocent of any wrongdoing. He knew that she was a good mother. When Tanya came by Stacy Mullins to pick up Karen, she didn't thank her for watching her child or ask how her child had been, but she was really wound up and she was sharing the news about the hospital's suspicions. She wasn't crying, but she was really excited and wanted to be vindicated. And Stacy politely declined to be a witness for her because Stacy felt that something was up.
So Michael remained in the hospital as his child abuse case was investigated further. On February 8th, Child Protective Investigator Mark Gillespie met with Intake Officer Jan Buck. Jan Buck had learned about Munchausen Syndrome by proxy at child abuse conferences, but this was her first encounter with one of these cases. And when we've talked about this before, we were saying if you're a pediatrician, you might see one of these in a career.
Right.
It's rare, fortunately.
Yeah, that is a good thing.
So a taped interview was done with Jim and Tanya, first separately, and then together. They both insisted that Tanya had not harmed Michael. He had a seizure disorder. Dr. Coleman told investigators that Michael's parents had disregarded medical advice on many occasions, and they had sought out unnecessary medical treatment. He was also concerned about the long-term effects all these hospitalizations may have had on Michael, and that it may have been causing or contributing to his developmental delays. But these are cases very difficult to prove because there's not a lot of physical evidence, unless you somehow catch them in the act.
Exactly. And going back to how rare this is, as I was reading new data on Munchausen's preparing for this, it's really noteworthy to say that since social media, where people can do these websites where they get charity, they get people to donate to them, GoFundMe pages, and they're on Facebook with pictures and getting attention. There actually have been more cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, just because it's easier to get more attention and even to make money off of it. Sad to say.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Alexander of Iowa City was one of Iowa's foremost experts in child abuse, and Munchausen syndrome by proxy was a really big interest of his. The trauma team contacted him for help with Michael Reid's case. And when he began to review the case, he also said it was a classic case. Tanya's background, her profession, and her relationship with her husband matched the classic case scenario, so he really saw this as a good possibility. Tanya and Jim were called for another interview at the juvenile court, and by that time they had a lawyer who had to really kind of physically move Tanya out of the room to stop her from saying too much, because she wouldn't stop talking. When Jim was questioned alone in the hospital, though, he said he had not witnessed any of Michael's seizures from the onset, so this contradicted what Tanya had said. But Jim said that he believed that Wanda, Tanya's mom, and Dr. Kudchetker, Michael's doctor from Illinois, had witnessed one of these events from the beginning. Now, one suspicious comment made by Tanya was that she didn't see any medical reason to keep Michael in the hospital at that point, because she said it would probably be another 2 to 3 weeks before he would have another episode. She insisted that he wasn't in danger because she knew he wouldn't have any seizures soon. So that's awfully damning.
Yeah, there's absolutely no evidence to back any of that up anyway.
No, but she felt pretty confident because she's the one causing them, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Now, paramedics who had been called out to the Reid home more than one occasion had never heard of Munchausen by proxy, but they were concerned about possibility of child abuse just the same. Tanya said on one occasion that Michael had some sort of breath holding, which vasovagal him into a respiratory arrest. She said that Michael had a history of seizures.
Yeah, but seizures didn't cause someone to stop breathing. And a vagal response doesn't affect the respiratory tract, right? That affects the heart.
Correct.
So that doesn't make sense either.
No, but again, like you said, she knows enough medicine to make her sound authoritative.
Yeah, to get away with it to a point.
Now, there's also a disturbing pattern noted in Tanya's emergency calls. Most of them were made on Tuesdays and Friday afternoons when Jim was working, and they were all made within a 3 to 4 hour time frame.
Yeah, so the daughter, Karen Reid, was interviewed by a social worker while she was at her school, but she'd been already talked to because she refused to discuss her brother. Still, she was able to say that she had never seen the beginning of one of Michael's spells. So that conflicted what Tanya had said as well. Tanya told Dr. Coleman that Dr. Kudchetker from Illinois had witnessed the onset of an episode, but in his interview with investigators, Dr. Kudchetker denied seeing any episode from its onset. And he was in the beginning very much on Tanya's side. He cared about her quite a bit. He'd gotten close to the family. But he said that wasn't true. He'd never seen one of the episodes from the beginning.
And when investigators talked with Tanya's mother, Wanda, she backed her daughter's story up. She was quite indignant on the phone, but she did reveal that she also had never witnessed any of Michael's or Morgan's spells, for that matter.
No, anytime she had been called in afterwards. But, there still wasn't enough evidence to permanently remove Michael from the custody of his parents. That's tough to do. Further observation and testing at the hospital was done, including an MRI, but all the results were negative, so they really had no choice at that point but to return Michael to his mother. Still, the case wasn't closed, of course. All of the medical records of Morgan and Michael Reid were being put together and reviewed in an investigation.
The Urbandale police were set up to be notified whenever a rescue unit was dispatched to the Reid's home. Now, after being accused of child abuse, many people wondered if any more of these episodes would occur. Unfortunately, it didn't take very long for the next one to happen. This occurred just after 5 o'clock in the evening, Tuesday, March 1st, which was in line with the previous pattern. After 911 was called and the paramedics were on their way, a detective arrived before the paramedics. Tanya was upstairs on the floor of the master bedroom holding her son. Michael was crying and sweating so much that his hair was soaking wet. When Tanya looked up, she was surprised to see the detective. Tanya said that she didn't know him, but the detective bent down to check on Michael. Tanya says very calmly, "Oh, this happens all the time. We're used to this. We'll just go down to the hospital and get fixed up."
So that's insanity.
Isn't it?
I mean, she doesn't even seem to realize that he could be dead. This is life-threatening. Although she had to because she'd already lost a daughter doing the same thing. So it really is insanity. And Tanya said that Michael had been outdoors playing with some other kids when he fell down and started crying. He needed a Band-Aid and a diaper change, so she took him upstairs and put him on the floor. She said that he was fighting her and all of a sudden he went still, which I think there's a little bit of truth in that part of the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she gave him mouth-to-mouth for 3 minutes before he began breathing on his own. So as Michael was being carried out of the house, Tanya asked that he be taken to a different hospital this time.
Uh-huh.
The paramedics felt like she was trying to avoid the doctors and nurses from Michael's last admission, where all the investigating had been done. I mean, otherwise it was a really odd choice because that first hospital was the area's primary pediatric hospital. So that's a bad sign. By this point, I mean, detectives and doctors are really afraid that Tanya's going to kill this boy. They felt like he needed to be removed and protected as soon as possible. You know, as he was getting older and stronger, he was fighting Tanya and she was becoming more aggressive. And with Morgan's case, she was much younger, they felt that Tanya had lost her temper and shaken or slammed her because she had died from the shaken baby syndrome, the bleeding in the brain.
So Dr. Zusha called the ER where Michael had been taken and notified the ER staff and doctor of her suspicions. But Tanya had taken Michael home that same night. So Prosecutor Melody Haynes had never heard of Munchausen Syndrome by proxy when she was told about Michael's case. Subpoenas were sent for records from Texas and Illinois, and stacks of medical records came into the prosecutor's office. A copy of Morgan Reid's autopsy report changed everything. The report by Dr. Ian Burkett read that Morgan had an acute subdural hematoma, which indicated trauma, but the last line read, "No evidence of child abuse."
Yeah, so this autopsy report really contradicted the finding of no child abuse, correct?
Correct.
And the trauma team determined that Morgan's death should have been treated as a homicide right from the beginning. The Iowa State Medical Examiner, Dr. Tom Bennett, found that the lack of bruises of the scalp and any skull injuries indicated that Morgan had died of shaken or slammed baby syndrome. And in these cases, like you said, it's a whiplash movement on the head and neck of the infant that creates the tearing of the small blood vessels that connect the brain to the underlining of the skull. So it's a very distinctive injury, correct?
Correct.
So the autopsy report indicated that there were 15 mLs of clotted blood in the subdural space over Morgan's posterior cerebral hemisphere. So that's like a tablespoon of blood. Considerable amount, right? Especially in an infant?
Well, yeah, it's enough to cause increased pressure on the brain and can lead to even death.
Which it did.
So investigator Jan Buck was able to reach Dr. Ian Burkett. This is the pathologist who had done Morgan's autopsy. He was now practicing in Arkansas and had never heard of shaken baby syndrome.
Is that scary or was that normal back then?
It was less well known, but you should be aware of it.
You're a pathologist.
Yeah.
Scary.
Now, the pathologist was given time to review literature on shaken baby syndrome. And he spoke to the investigator again a few days later. And at this time, he concluded that Morgan's autopsy was consistent with shaken baby syndrome. So this made Morgan's case a homicide.
So on March 16th, the pediatric team met to discuss the pattern of episodes and Morgan's subdural hematoma. And after this meeting, they were all in agreement that Michael Reid was in imminent danger. The evidence strongly supported Munchausen Syndrome by proxy. It was agreed that Michael would be removed from the Reid home. But they said they felt safe leaving Karen in the home because she was old enough to talk. I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah, I guess on the one hand, she's never had any episodes at all. So that's good.
Yeah.
But if there's one kid that's been killed and another kid who they're trying to kill, I'd take the other child out of the home too.
I think to be safe they probably should have, because maybe she wouldn't do the same thing she did to the younger children, but she's left with this one child in the home. I'd be afraid of what she might do.
Exactly. So Michael was picked up at daycare and taken into state custody. Jim Reid was called and notified at his office, and he agreed to notify his wife. Before Michael was in the care of a foster family, he was hospitalized overnight and examined. He was very healthy. There aren't many legal precedents for Munchausen by proxy abuse cases. There's a notable case from 1981, California versus Priscilla Phillips. She was an adoptive mother of 2 Korean girls, and she poisoned them with salt in their baby bottles. This is something Munchausen mom Lacey Spears did to her son Garnet, and finally killing him. Then there's a case we covered last year, Mary Beth Tinning, which looks like a Munchausen by proxy case, but she was only convicted of the murder of her 9th child, although she likely killed all 9 of her other kids in a 14-year span.
Right, but the Tinning case was back in the, 50s? That was a really old case.
Yeah.
So really no one seemed to have heard of that.
No, they were all SIDS cases.
Exactly.
As the investigation into Morgan's death intensified, Karen was sent to live with Tanya's sister Rodina in Garland, Texas. Jim Reid took a job in Mississippi as vice president of marketing at Pioneer Beef. Now, if Michael suffered any apneic episodes while in foster care, then there's not going to be a case against Tanya. But he had no medical emergencies while with his foster family. He suffered from some bad dreams, and he certainly didn't like to have his face touched. But overall, he was a happy, playful kid.
Yeah, and actually became potty trained within a couple of months. In June of 1988, the juvenile court heard hours of testimony and made the decision to leave Michael in foster care for his own protection. If someone from Tanya's family didn't take custody of Michael within 6 months, there was a possibility that a foster family could adopt him permanently. So Tanya's oldest sister, Beverly Kay, and her husband volunteered to take in Michael. Tanya's other sisters actually were convinced that Michael did have a genetic disorder, and they were afraid to take care of him because of all of his health issues. But let's remember, in foster care, he's fine.
Right.
Which is probably the most condemning evidence there is. As case investigators reached out to all doctors who had cared for the Reid children, they made contact with a Dr. Richard Perez. And Perez had called the Urbandale police in January 1988 to report the suspicious rescue calls made from the Reid home. But the police had never followed up on his claims at all. Now everyone agreed that Tanya was a lonely, needy person, and it seemed that her needs were being met by her numerous interactions with doctors and nurses and rescue personnel. A review of hospital records would show 18 documented apneic episodes for Michael and 20 for Morgan, and all of these episodes required resuscitation and a claim by Tanya that she had performed mouth-to-mouth and saved them. So the prosecutor, Melody Haynes, went to Dr. Kudchecker's office in Illinois to talk to him about Tanya Reid and her children. He had cared for Karen, Morgan, and Michael. This was a kind guy who always gave his patients' parents the benefit of the doubt. Of all the doctors involved in the care of the Reid children, he really seemed at first like the most doubtful of Tanya's guilt. He had really liked and trusted Tanya as a mother and as a nurse. So he recalled Morgan's first episode of apnea, which had occurred on August 8, 1983. And he'd been called in and admitted her for 5 days of testing, which included blood tests, lab workups, CAT scan, chest x-rays, and an EEG, which all came back normal. So he had continued to see Morgan and received her hospital results, even though Jerry Skirka was her pediatrician of record. And one time he was in the hospital and saw Morgan directly after paramedics brought her into the ER, and he would recall that she looked normal and healthy. He learned of additional episodes on August 20th, September 8th, September 17th, 20th, and 30th, October 27th, and then 2 in November. On one day, November 9th. He saw Morgan in his office on December 1st for an upper respiratory infection, and 3 days after that, Morgan had stopped breathing at 2:15 p.m. while home alone with her mother. Mouth-to-mouth was given again by Tanya, and Morgan was discharged home that same day. But he hadn't learned about Morgan's death until after the Reids returned to Illinois. Tanya brought Karen to his office for an appointment and told him about Morgan. She was already pregnant with Michael by that time, and he had felt sorry for her. But when Melody Haynes showed Cudchecker Morgan's autopsy report, then he did know that this baby had been murdered. Blood on the brain didn't match a SIDS diagnosis, of course. And he knew about subdurals from his years on staff, where he'd worked at Cook County Hospital.
Well, he should.
Well, right. So Melody then went over Michael's medical records with Dr. Cudchecker. The first episode had occurred on May 28, 1985 at 4:30 p.m. He'd stopped breathing and was resuscitated by Tanya. All of the tests done in the hospital were normal. Michael was put on the stimulant drug, theophylline, and the drug was usually used on preemies, but he didn't know what else could possibly help that child.
Yeah, theophylline's an old asthma drug. Keeps your airways open. Does act as a respiratory stimulant. Some premature infants are put on it to help them breathe better.
Yeah, more recently, haven't they been put on caffeine?
Yeah, same deal. So Michael's second episode was at 3:20 p.m. on June 17th. That time he was 6 weeks old. Tanya told a similar story, but again, Michael seemed completely normal. Shockingly, episodes 3, 4, and 5 happened all on one day, July 10th, 1985. Dr. Cudchecker remembered this day very well. Tanya called the office that morning. She said Michael was having spells again, and she was worried. She said there had been several that morning. She said that he was becoming more difficult to arouse also. The doctor told her to come to the office immediately. Okay, I would have sent him to the hospital immediately, but...
That's what I was thinking.
When the doctor walked into the room where the nurse had put Michael, he found Tanya bent over him and giving mouth-to-mouth on the exam table. Michael had circumoral cyanosis, which is some blueness, blue tinge around his lips, his mouth. He hadn't seen the episode from the onset. He was entering the room as Michael was in the process of being revived. This series of episodes ended up keeping Michael in the hospital for 13 days. He was observed, poked, and medicated. His theophylline was discontinued, and he was started on phenobarbital, which, as we said before, is an anticonvulsant. That August, Michael was hospitalized again. Tanya provided this history, and I'm paraphrasing. About 10 days ago, following a nap, he turned limp, dusky, and had frothiness around his lips. Heart rate is unknown. He didn't have his monitor on. It lasted 30 to 45 seconds. She said that she gave her son mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and afterwards he cried an angry cry. Then she mentioned that he had a prolonged brainwave test tracing, and she thought the episode suggested a seizure. By this time, Michael was not on phenobarbital, but on Dilantin, another anticonvulsant.
So Michael had his 7th and 8th episodes in one day, December 2nd, and they followed an office visit where Tanya had told the doctor that Michael had had 4 episodes in the past 4 days, and he also had a low-grade fever. So again, Michael was admitted to the hospital, where he suffered another flurry of tests, and everything came back normal again. His 9th episode was February 4th, 1986 at 5:12 p.m. Tanya had reported 4 episodes that day alone. So Michael was hospitalized overnight for observation, and again, everything came back normal. His last apnea episode under Dr. Cudchecker was on April 7th of 1986. And this one was different because Tanya described him as being rigid and stiff, and she told the paramedics that his balance had been off for days. Then the last time Michael was seen by Dr. Cudchecker was on June 3rd. He had a fever, a stuffy nose, and an ear infection, and that's when Tanya told him they were moving back to Texas. So through records reviews, the prosecution had figured out that Tanya had been flip-flopping between the 2 suburban Chicago pediatricians when they lived in Illinois. When one didn't tell her what she wanted to hear or order the test she wanted, she'd gone to the other one. So Dr. Skirka reviewed Morgan's medical records with the prosecutor, and Morgan's first office visit had been 8 days after her first apnea episode. A pneumogram was done at Children's Memorial Hospital and the results were normal. And 4 days later, Morgan quit breathing for the second time, and that time she was admitted to the hospital for 5 days of testing. So that fall in September, Morgan had 6 medical crises. And by the time Tanya brought Morgan to see Dr. Skirka in his office in late September, he was already beginning to have some very serious doubts about what was happening with this baby. He reviewed her hospitalizations and evaluations and told Tanya that he was really concerned that family problems could be at the root of the problem. He could not explain the baby's spells, and the baby looked normal. Then the very next day, Dr. Skirka got a call at 2 p.m. from the hospital ER. Morgan had come in after another spell and appeared fine, but this time she had some crusted blood in her nostrils. And he made a note, no one else has visualized these episodes. So Dr. Skirka was concerned that every episode was only seen by Tanya. After 2 normal office visits in October, Morgan stopped breathing again, October 26th, again with normal testing. Then incidents on November 9th were quite disturbing. There'd been 2 in one day. The second one occurred when they were at Children's Memorial Hospital. So this time Tanya had been at Morgan's bedside from admission, and after several days of testing, Morgan stopped breathing and turned blue in her crib. According to witnesses, prior to the episode, the curtains had been open and Morgan was seen in her crib. Then just moments later, the curtains were closed and Morgan was seen limp and blue. Again, the only witness was Tanya, and she had resuscitated her daughter herself.
Yeah, so after this hospital stay, Dr. Skirka was very troubled about the situation. There'd never been spells at night or when anyone else was around. Tanya's calm demeanor also bothered him. After each episode, which were scary as hell to see, Tanya showed no reservations about taking her baby home. Now, I don't know about you, but I would certainly insist that the child stay in the hospital until we figured out what was going on.
Oh, I think most parents would, sure.
Now, unfortunately, Dr. Skirka knew nothing about Munchausen Syndrome by proxy. Looking back, though, he could see in his notes many of the key signs of the syndrome. Finally, in November of 1983, Skirka confronted Tanya as carefully as he could. He didn't say outright that he was suspicious Tanya was smothering Morgan, because he was afraid of scaring her off. So he approached it a different way. He expressed concern about why they couldn't find anything medically wrong with Morgan and why the spells only happened under Tanya's care. He couldn't come up with an answer for this. So he suggested counseling. He was hopeful that she might open up to a counselor and maybe she really wanted help. But Tanya reacted very defensively and left in pretty much an indignant mood. She never brought her children back to Dr. Skirka after that visit.
Right. So, I mean, how do you approach parents with this? It's pretty impossible. They're so defensive. I've never heard of one of these parents saying, "You're right, please give me help."
No. Well, that comes out in the courtroom. But I think the way he did it, you emphasize unable to arrive at a diagnosis. We've done 8 zillion tests. They're all negative.
Sure.
And here's the things we know. These spells occur at certain times of the day, certain days of the week. Tanya, the mother, is the only one to witness them. You just keep pointing out these things.
Yeah, but there's no way in hell she was going to admit it.
No.
No.
There's certainly not.
Well, it was interesting that if you look at Tanya's employment records from the Family Hospital Center in Amarillo, they show that Tanya wasn't afraid to use her kids as reasons to miss work either. Over a 2-month period, she missed 9 days of work due to her children's illnesses. And then something on her January 1987 job application was disturbing also. And this was after Morgan had died, because she died in 1984. Under the reason why she had left her previous job, Tanya had written the birth of a handicapped child, referring to Michael. But Michael was not a handicapped child. I mean, he might have had some delays later, but it really seemed that she'd written that just in an attempt to get some sympathy and attention. Why would you say that?
So you can get sympathy and attention.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So the connections between the Reid children's medical crises and what was going on in Tanya's life were pretty easy to see in retrospect. There was the fact that the apneic episodes happened while Jim was at work, but also when Tanya was working or near to her family, there were much fewer episodes. When Tanya worked for over a year before they moved to Iowa, Michael had a period of no spells. When Karen, her oldest child, was born, Tanya lived close to her family, and that child never had any problems. But then when Morgan was born, Tanya was away from her family and she was unemployed, and there were multiple episodes requiring resuscitation and hospitalization. She was also alone and not working in Illinois when Michael was born. So police and rescue records showed that Tanya's children weren't the only ones who had gotten emergency help in the past. 4 times during her pregnancy with Michael, Tanya was taken to the hospital for passing out and being found unconscious in her home. And by the time paramedics would arrive, Tanya was fine. So it's pretty, well, I don't know if I'd say it's normal, but it has happened many times that someone who has these behaviors of Munchausen Syndrome by proxy has a history of Munchausen Syndrome.
Correct. So on August 10th, 1988, Tanya Reid was arrested and charged with felony child endangerment in the case of Brandon Michael. Prosecutor Melody Haynes had put together a case to show a pattern of abuse which began with Morgan and continued with her son. Tanya spent that night in jail, but she was allowed to return to her parents' home to await trial. Michael was living in Hereford, Texas with her sister, Beverly Kay. Beverly Kay continued to support her sister's innocence even though Michael had not had any seizures or apnea since being taken out of Tanya's custody and living with them.
Right, but Tanya did have some strict restrictions as conditions of her bail. She couldn't be left alone with Michael for even a second. And whoever supervised her visits with Michael couldn't even leave the room. Tanya was allowed to work at the small family medical center hospital in Amarillo, though. And Jim was working a job he hated in Mississippi and visiting his son every few weeks. Investigators in Iowa were really outraged, though, when they learned that Tanya was working in a hospital in Amarillo. You know, not only that, she was allowed to work in the nursery there. I mean, that's not funny, Dick. She could have killed babies, right?
Right.
They called the Amarillo hospital and asked if they were aware of the serious allegations against Tanya, but the supervisor there defended Tanya, saying that she was innocent until proven guilty, pretty much saying, don't you guys have anything better to do? So Tanya was allowed to continue to work in that nursery and as a postpartum nurse, which is pretty damn disturbing.
Hopefully under supervision.
Well, I guess, but I mean, we've done cases on nurses with this affliction. So although Tanya saw Jim on his periodic visits to see his son, their relationship was pretty frayed. He stopped wearing his wedding ring, and when Tanya asked him about it, he told her that he had stopped wearing it because he wanted to discourage women from approaching him. So according to Jim, during this time married men were in high demand for single women to hook up with, because AIDS was out there and single people were afraid of AIDS, so the women thought if they hooked up with a married man it'd be safer. So if he didn't wear a wedding ring, he was less likely to be hit on, if you can follow that twisted train of thought.
I can barely follow it.
Yeah. Well, there was some bad news for Tanya when the Polk County District Court decided that information about Morgan Reid's death would be admissible in her upcoming trial. The prosecutor offered Tanya a plea deal of willful neglect of a minor, which could have resulted in probation only, but Tanya refused that. Her attorney also asked for a bench trial because he thought the jury might be very judgmental of Tanya.
Well, that's probably true.
It is, but I would think if you've got a reasonable judge, he's going to see the pattern and she's screwed.
Right. Then a Texas district attorney was asked by Iowa prosecutors what he knew about Tanya Thaxton Reid. He knew very little, but he brought up the case with his parents one night over a family dinner. A family member remembered Tanya Thaxton from her high school days, and this family member remembered a big to-do when Tanya was a 15-year-old high school student. She was babysitting an infant back then who stopped breathing. With Tanya as the baby's sole caretaker, not witnessed by anyone, the baby stopped breathing. Tanya resuscitated the child, and she was given the town's Good Neighbor Award.
Yeah, so this wasn't good for her case at all.
For sure.
The prosecutor's office could have introduced this as new evidence if they were given a continuance, but they thought the downside of that was that it would give the defense team time to develop a plan to minimize the damage of that information. So the prosecution decided to take a chance on it, which did work out for them. If Tanya decided to take the stand in her own defense, that would open up the door to revealing this new information. And they'd be caught off guard by it, clearly.
Right. So I guess what the prosecution's decided is that they have enough to convict her.
Yes.
They probably don't need this evidence from when she was a 15-year-old.
No, but it would certainly help if it happens to come out.
It sure would.
So they had a Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy expert, and he said that he was sure Tanya would take the stand. He said that these defendants are well known to deny any wrongdoing and to work hard to defend themselves, thinking they can talk themselves out of anything. Tanya believed that the judge would see her side and find her not guilty once he heard from her. So February 27th, 1989 was the first day of this trial. In the prosecution's opening statement, they said that they would prove a pattern of Tanya abusing her son, and the defense attorney argued that there was a medical genetic reason for Michael's health problems. Several physicians testified, as did Dr. Rosen and the Munchausen expert Dr. Alexander. And it was really interesting how the expert explained that Munchausen syndrome by proxy was a pediatric diagnosis for the child and not a psychological diagnosis of the parent. So I guess there you're just kind of splitting hairs.
Well, a little bit. I mean, you're saying that it doesn't imply any illness or psychological illness in the parent, but it is a syndrome in the child. So, sure.
Yeah, but there has to be something psychologically wrong with that parent, too.
Well, of course.
But that's not what we're really concerned with at this point, because it's about protecting the child.
Right.
So he went over the characteristics of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, including illnesses which are unexplained, inappropriate symptoms, mothers who are calm in emergency situations and can seem happy or at ease in the hospital, families with unexplained infant deaths, a perpetrator with a medical background, and physicians who are misled or who have never seen illnesses like the ones in question. And Michael's case did have all of these characteristics. There was one doctor from Texas who testified in Tanya's defense, and he testified that enlarged ventricles in Michael's brain were evidence of an abnormal brain. But then Dr. Alexander testified that apnea over time had caused changes in Michael's brain, enlarging his ventricles. So according to him, the smothering of Michael had caused the enlargement of the ventricles. And he also testified that when perpetrators are confronted, their denial is completely unyielding. Even in the face of video evidence, the denial usually persists.
So Dr. Alexander's diagnosis for Michael was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and so was his diagnosis of Morgan Reid, based on a complete review of medical records. Dr. Alexander also said that Morgan had died of shaken baby syndrome at the hands of her mother. Supporting documentation was several nurses' notes indicating that Tanya showed difficulty controlling her anger, and she was frustrated with her kids. The Munchausen expert, Dr. Alexander, gave the testimony which was the most worrisome to Tanya's defense attorney. During a break, he told Tanya that things were looking bad for her. He offered to talk to the prosecutor about getting the plea bargains so she would have a chance at probation. But she wouldn't hear of it. Tanya insisted on fighting, just as was predicted.
Absolutely, yeah. So the prosecution's final witness was medical examiner Tom Bennett, and he was very, very educated man. He was board certified in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology, and he was asked to give a description of shaken baby syndrome.
So Dr. Bennett described a basic constellation of findings, being subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhages, and the absence of any other cause to explain the blood around the brain, such as direct head trauma. So this syndrome, the shaken baby syndrome, occurs when a child is forcibly shaken, and the shaking tears the tiny blood vessels, which bridge from the top of the brain to the inner surface of the skull, where the meninges, the layers of the brain, attach. Then bleeding accumulates around the brain, and the baby will die because of increased pressure in the brain.
Yeah, and not all babies die. Remember, we saw a documentary. A lot of these kids just have severe handicaps and a lot to struggle with their entire lives.
Exactly. So Dr. Bennett ended his testimony by saying that, in his opinion, Morgan had died from shaken baby syndrome.
That was a huge deal.
Big deal.
So Tanya did take the stand in her own defense as predicted. This was on March 2nd, and she described Morgan's apnea episodes very detailed and very tearfully. She said that she and Jim had asked for an autopsy after her death, and one would not have been done if they hadn't insisted, which I don't believe. She said that she was terrified when she became pregnant with Michael because she believed there was a genetic reason for her daughter's death. Tanya's alibis to the onset of the apneic episodes were all disproven, though. She'd told people that Dr. Kudchedker and her mother had witnessed an episode, but both of them testified that they hadn't. Her mom, Wanda, didn't take the stand, but she had said so in an interview with abuse investigators, so that was documented. Prosecutor Haynes asked Tanya on cross-examination if she'd ever been in charge of another child who had a similar problem to Morgan or Michael's, and she answered that she couldn't remember any. But that's when Haynes brought up her 1974 Good Neighbor Award.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, when that happened, Jim Reid could be heard muttering, "Oh shit," under his breath, because he knew about it, and so did the rest of the Thaxton family. I don't know if the defense attorney did, but they were just hoping that the prosecution wouldn't find that. So what had happened is it was back in October of 1974 when Tanya was hired to babysit 4-month-old Scotty Simmons while his parents attended a church function on a Tuesday evening. And about 9:30 p.m., Wanda was in the bathtub when Tanya called her, all excited to say that Scotty was having a hard time breathing, maybe due to congestion, and Wanda told her to call Scotty's mom to see if he was on any medication. But within minutes, Tanya called 911. Then she called Scotty's mom and told her that Scotty had quit breathing and the paramedics were on the way. A police officer actually arrived at the Simmons house and found Scotty blue and limp on the living room sofa. So Scotty was taken to the hospital and he did survive. Then, 1 month later, Tanya was notified that she was receiving the Ladies' Chamber of Commerce Good Neighbor Award. But Scotty did have some problems from this. He was brain damaged. He was in the hospital for 2.5 weeks. He didn't walk until he was nearly 3 years old. And he suffered seizures until he was 6. Now, fortunately, despite all these problems, he did end up living a pretty normal life as an adult. He was able to overcome most of that. But Tanya on the stand claimed she hadn't remembered the event. But this really helped the prosecution to show this lifelong pattern of Tanya's. It couldn't be her kid's genetic condition if it had happened to a child she babysat.
Tanya was found guilty of felony child endangerment and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Jim divorced her and remarried, and he was able to raise Michael and Karen with his new wife. Michael was a happy and healthy boy, and he had no further apneic episodes. Tanya insisted that he had simply outgrown his spells. Then in 1993, Tanya was indicted in Texas for the murder of Morgan Reid. The witnesses were the same who had testified at her Iowa trial. Morgan's body was exhumed, but no new evidence about her cause of death was found. Tanya again took the stand in her own defense.
She didn't learn her lesson at all. By that time her mother Wanda was broke. Her dad had died of a heart attack years earlier and had left behind some debt. But Tanya's 3 sisters still supported her innocence, and they were there. This one was a jury trial, and they reached a guilty verdict in 1 day. Tanya cried, of course, and her mother was devastated. And Tanya was sentenced to 62 years in prison, required to serve 20 years before she'd be eligible for parole. But then, in February of 1995, Tanya's murder conviction was overturned. The court decided that the prosecution hadn't met its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and also that the judge had failed to act on a defense motion for a change of venue. So for a while she thought she was in the clear, but then they decided to take her to trial again, and she was retried in Hereford, Texas in 1996. A plea was offered again that would have sentenced her to less than 10 years in prison, but Tanya opted for a trial to prove her innocence. She claimed she'd been a good mother, and the Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy diagnosis was nothing more than a vendetta by the prosecution.
Yeah, but the jury found Tanya guilty again. She was sentenced to 40 years at the women's prison in Gateville, Texas.
Yeah, so according to that Munchausen expert, Dr. Randall Alexander, there has been a big increase in the education and public awareness of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, shaken baby syndrome, and SIDS over the past several years. Recently, electronic medical records have been used to track doctor shopping and to flag some parents who use an excessive number of providers or whose children have been hospitalized a lot. And such cases now go to court more frequently, and there have been more convictions. At this point, though, treatment to rehabilitate the offenders really hasn't been established. The experts are unfortunately really pessimistic about successful treatment being developed anytime soon. Dr. Alexander wrote recently that such a treatment would likely include an admission of guilt by the perpetrators and the learning of alternate coping strategies to fill the need for attention. But of course, trials of this treatment would be very risky, and treatment would not be worth risking a child's life by reintroducing the child to the offending caregiver. So it's really hard to get anywhere with that.
Yeah, it would seem very high risk to try to do that.
Yeah. So just a note for this podcast, we changed the name of Tanya's surviving children. And our references were the Iowa Polk County Court Records Archive, the Texas Criminal Court Records, the 2019 Swedish Shaken Baby Syndrome Report and Review, and a book titled Cruel Deception by Greg Olson. There's also a Forensic Files episode titled Broken Bond from Season 3, Episode 12, about this case. True Crime Brewery's music was written and produced very kindly by Tristan Capel. Now, if you haven't joined Team Tie Grabber, are you purposely hurting my feelings?
Oh, feel stupid, nothing.
We have good stuff coming up, though, including one of the most twisted women killers in recent years, right?
Sheila DeVallo is a piece of work.
Yes, I've caught you reading about her and you're just shaking your head.
Yeah.
Like you can't believe it. Our commercial-free members-only episodes come out every month, sometimes more, and there's a backlog of over 40 episodes that are all yours to listen to as soon as you become a member. Recent episodes include the murder of Josh Hilberling, the kidnapping of Shannon Matthews, the search for Robert Fisher. The list goes on and on. There are actually some older ones I think are quite good that I would recommend you listen to, like the one that has our interview with a scuba expert in Australia on the underwater death of newlywed Tina Watson. Also the crimes of Philip Markoff, sometimes called the Craigslist Killer. That was a huge story up in the Boston area. We used to live up there when that happened. And you know what? You can be a Tie Grabber member for as little as $4 a month. And when you join, you have your choice of a Welcome to the Brewery gift as well, which we'll send to you with a nice handwritten thank you note. So if you want to do it and make me feel better, just go to tiegrabber.com and click on subscribe, and then you'll learn more.
Yeah, and I'd also mention that if you're in the need or have a yen for a shirt or a hoodie or whatever swag you can associate with True Crime Brewery, go to the store. Our company that does this stuff for us, called TeePublic, is having this fantastic sale. So not only are you going to get some real quality merchandise, some of it's up to 35% off. So check it out.
Yeah, I think some of the t-shirts are $13 this week, and the sale ends, I think, next Tuesday. So check it out. Never hurts to get yourself a nice hoodie or a t-shirt and support the brewery.
That's right.
So what do we have for feedback today?
We have a voicemail and, 2 or 3 emails.
All right, let's do the voicemail first, as we tend to do.
Okay, this is Kim. She's going to give some comments of hers on Kelsey Barrett.
Okay, interesting case.
It was.
Hi, Jill and Dick. It's Kim from New Hampshire. I have listened to your podcast for almost 2 years now. I've re-listened. My granddaughter has accidentally walked in the room while I'm listening to you and thinks it's her first grade teacher. Your voices are very soothing. Your banter is wonderful. Podcasts are awesome. You guys do all the research. It's very enjoyable. And I'm not saying that it's entertainment to listen to these horrific stories. I just finished the Kelsey Barrett and I'm livid. I just cleaned my entire house listening to it, so pissed off. I just cannot believe that woman, Lee, whatever her name is, I don't care to remember it, got off with nothing, basically. She knocked on the door of a fellow human being. She looked in her eyes she knew what was about to happen and tried to hand her a unpoisoned coffee. Well, aren't you a freaking saint? She makes me sick. I just cannot believe that she's a nurse. I mean, they're there to care for people, to help people get well. And she was complicit, 100%. She should have got accomplice to first-degree murder, and the fact that she didn't even reach out to the police after seeing this girl, the mother of this little child, Kaylee, it makes me sick. Keep doing what you're doing, guys. You're awesome. I love listening to your podcast, and that's all I have to say. And I love your beer reviews. Because of you, I started drinking IPAs, and I like the IPA all day. I forgot the name of it now. Oh, boy. Well, that's senility for you. Take care.
Well, thank you, Kim. I love Kim. She reminds me of many of my friends up in New England, right? No bullshit.
That's right.
I really like it. I agree with you that that woman is a piece of shit and got away with being part of that murder.
Yes, she did.
Horrible.
As they said in one of the documentaries we watched, sometimes you got to deal with the devil.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I couldn't do it.
Nope. And the IPA that you like is Founder's All Day IPA. Called All Day because you can drink it all day.
So low alcohol, which is good.
Yeah, it's not real high.
Okay. Well, I know Founders make some excellent beers.
They do. One of my favorite breweries.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Kim. We really appreciate you calling in to us.
Yes.
So
right.
let's do these emails.
Okay. I got one from Pulaski Girl, and she has a case suggestion. So 10 years have passed since this young man was found murdered. His Pulaski County, Kentucky family says they have no justice for Kevin. Kevin was killed, his truck burnt, and later they found his body burnt in a burn pile, along with another person's bones. Please look into this. He's a close family friend. Murder in a small town.
Well, I'm really sorry about that. We certainly have our sympathies.
For sure. You know, it's kind of one thing when you're just kind of dispassionately hearing about this stuff, but when you have a personal connection.
Well, it is important, right? Because all of these cases we talk about are people just like we are.
Right.
So it's important to remember that and be reminded of it for sure.
So this occurred 2009. November 9th, Kevin Price left work at the end of his shift, didn't make it home. His worried family notified authorities, and they found his burned-out truck later that evening. There was no sign of Kevin. His burned body was found about 3 weeks later in a burn pit with someone else's bones in it also. So that's kind of eerie.
That's very eerie.
Despite an intensive investigation, his murder is unsolved to this day. That might be something interesting to do.
And sometimes getting the word out can help in an unsolved case. Not to give us too much credit because we're just a podcast, but you never know. It helps to share these things sometimes.
Yes, it does.
Yep.
We'll look into that. My brief foray in getting some literature on him, I didn't find too much, but I'll keep looking because it sounds like a good case.
Yes, so thank you, Pulaski Girl. And then we have a case suggestion from Deborah.
Yeah, Deborah, I didn't print out her message because it was pretty brief. She just said, you ought to check into this, basically.
Okay, so the case is Edward.
I would pronounce it Zakruski.
You're so much better at pronunciations.
I'm just faking it.
Edward Zakruski
Sure.
was a career Air Force man. He met and married his wife when he was stationed in South Korea. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. In 1992, he was transferred to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and 2 years later, he bought a house. Several months after the house purchase, the wife Sylvia asked for a divorce. Then one day in June 1994, he didn't report for work. When police went to his house, they found his wife and children stabbed to death. He was not at home. He had fled to Hawaii, where he was recognized on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries and turned himself in. So this is a solved case, but sounds pretty interesting. So I think we should look into that.
Yeah, he was extradited back to Florida. He was going to go to trial, but he pled guilty, and he's on death row.
So then we have one more case suggestion from Tennille.
Tennille wants us to do a podcast on the murder of Jennifer Cave. While it is extremely gruesome, the players in this case are fascinating. A so-called friend of Jennifer's shot her, and he and a woman named Laura Hall decapitated, mutilated her, placed a gun in her severed neck and shot her in the head.
Ugh.
What's more, these monsters who did this were highly educated people attending the University of Texas in Austin. When Jennifer's family didn't hear from her, they had an idea where she was, at Colton's. The dad broke out a window in Colton's house and found Jennifer's mutilated body in the tub.
Oh my God, that poor father.
Holy cow.
Jeez.
Then there's Laura Hall. I cannot even explain Laura in any way that would do her justice. You can watch an episode on 48 Hours called In Too Deep. There's so much I'd like to tell you, but Catherine Casey wrote an excellent book called The Descent into Hell. This is a case I know you'd be intrigued by, and it's rarely covered. So it would be new. Your listeners would appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, Tennille. It does sound really fascinating and horrific.
Doesn't it?
All right. This is a long one, so I think we ought to call it a day. And just thanks to everyone for your feedback and for listening to us. We appreciate it more than you'll ever know.
We do. We enjoy doing this. It's always nice to know that people like to listen to us.
Yes. So I hope life treats you well until next time when we see you again at the Quiet End.
Got it.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.